recorded live.
Welcome to the Virtualization Security Roundtable podcast, episode number 119. And we're back from a hiatus 2 weeks ago. Joining us today is Eben Rodriguez, IT industry veteran, now serving as Director of Virtualization Cloud Testing for NSS Labs in Austin. Thank you for joining us, Eben.
Thank you.
Michael Berman should be joining us later. He's a subject matter expert in security virtualization working at TitleScale, a stealth mode startup. Hopefully joining us as well is Mike Foley from VMware Marketing, Technical Marketing. Myself is Edward Haletke, a.k.a. TechsyWill, just about anywhere else, and I've written a few books that you can find on Amazon. And our special guest today, and I'm probably going to really horribly butcher the name, is Dimitrios Styliadis. Did I get that right, Dimitri?
Yes, pretty good.
Dimitri is the CTO and co-founder of New Age Networks that is bringing network virtualization, SDN, to the data center and the cloud space. So we're actually going to be talking a little bit about SDN today and security. And you did a little blurb on your email to me, Dimitri, and that actually was rather interesting. Why don't you go ahead and start us off? Take a couple of minutes.
Sure. So as people might know, the goal of SDN is to bring programmability, if you want, into the network and to a certain extent bridge the gap between what application developers want and what networks really give, because at least so far there is very little communication between the two. But as we bring more of this, if you want, software techniques into the network, we have to be aware, depending on what we do, that this might bring also good and bad things related to security to the network, right? So some of the capabilities that SDN brings into the network that can affect security is actually the ability to provide much more visibility to both IT administrators, network administrators, and application developers about what is happening into the network. So as part of our, for example, network virtualization solution, we provide mechanisms for very detailed analytics where somebody can see every application endpoint and get detailed information about the type of traffic that this application endpoint is sending or consuming from the network. Now, by utilizing these analytics, either in short or longer time scales, one can potentially attempt to identify either security attacks. It can identify affinity rules, for example, which application components talk to which application components, and based on this, it can use them to define abnormal operations, right? So to give you an example, if I have an application and through the analytics in the network, I can figure out that out of the 100 servers I have in my network, these 20 servers tend to pretty regularly talk to each other. And then suddenly we see that somebody outside this cluster is very actively trying to talk to these 20 servers that form an application, then this can be an alarm that something might be happening that is out of the normal there. And we don't know at this point if it's a security issue or if it's some change or modification in some application, but nevertheless, we have some indication that something is happening, right? So we can use these analytics in order to understand better the status of the network and correlate between behavior and potential security threats.
Let's step back before we go much further down that and talk a little bit more about the basics of SDN, because right now when I look at SDN, I see that SDN works great in the physical switch world as long as you have the necessary physical switch endpoints. But as soon as we extend that into the actual virtualization layers, the endpoints don't exist for some of the technologies. So we either have to put in a virtual machine that acts as an endpoint, kind of like Nicira did for STT, or we have to build into the actual virtual switch the SDN technology, which is what VMware is doing with VMware NSX. Or we have to basically use a gateway to gateway between what what you do with SBP, which is SPB, shortest path routing. Sorry. When you start dealing with that, you actually are gatewaying between the shortest path routing switches, which are all physical today, to a VLAN that's sitting on a host somewhere and hoping that east-west traffic is going to be doing the right thing between hosts, and that, hey, if I'm not talking on that network because my east-west traffic is actually 100% within inside of my virtual machine, my virtualization host, it may never even touch the SDN switches. It may not be using SDN. So SDN actually, unless you have the gateways at the right spot, seems extremely limited to just the physical environment and only for extremely large environments. But smaller environments, no one really cares. You don't get any real benefit to it. But when you tie that all together, now there was actually a huge number of security issues related to the fact that SDN is based on these gateway technologies.
Well, I don't think necessarily that it is, actually. I think that the network endpoint is actually the virtual switch. When we talk about virtualization, the network endpoint is the virtual switch. It's not necessarily. Well, it's not necessarily an outside gateway. I think in a lot of cases, the network endpoint, and in most technologies like what we are building and like what other several people are building, is that the condition is that network virtualization starts as close at the edge as possible, and that edge is actually the virtual switch in one form.
I think we're missing. I think this is the same conversation I had in a post I did a couple of weeks back, in that networking folks and virtualization and cloud security folks are talking past each other. In fact, network virtualization folks and server virtualization folks are talking past each other. You say virtual switch, you mean a switch that's sitting in some sort of hardware somewhere. When I say virtual switch, I mean the one the VMs are actually talking to.
I'm talking about the one VMs are talking to.
Right?
Yeah, but unless you have...
Here, we're talking about, say, a Citrix has OVS, Citrix Zen Server, KVM hypervisor from Red Hat.
Yeah, but OVS is a limited construct. Not everybody has it yet.
Well,
everybody will have it soon, but not everybody has it.
Right, but
we're talking about a new environment, and we're talking about new ways of building networks, and we are assuming that not everyone's using VMware, and we can.
I'm not assuming everybody's using. But not everybody's using an OVS.
For our new cloud data centers, you see a lot of OVS in these data centers.
But you got to remember, it's not new that was really the problem, and this is where I say that there is actually a security nightmare waiting to happen. If I'm setting up brand new greenfield, this is a non-issue. You go with whatever works everywhere. So if it's OVS everywhere, you do OVS everywhere. You make it all work. Greenfield, you have the planning, the time, the energy to do it. But if you're talking about taking an existing cloud deployment, saying using a mix of Hyper-V and Zen, KVM, and possibly even VMware, OVS is not in every version.
Well, in a cloud
you may not have it. Now you actually have to insert OVS. If you're going to do this, you have to insert OVS as a VM, as a VM endpoint. How do you migrate?
In every data center, there's growth. You're either adding new racks, or you're taking out old racks and then adding new racks. So you're replacing this. You're not going to go into a production data center where you have hundreds of servers and start unplugging the servers from one switch and plugging them into some new SDN switch. You're not going to take your virtual machines and convert them from whatever hypervisor to some new hypervisor just because you want to do it. You're going to add a new environment, and this new environment is going to have these SDN capabilities. And you're
absolutely right, but how do you gateway between the two?
Exactly. So let me try to jump into that, right?
So we're basically just established a gateway mode for old to new, and that just seems fraught with all sorts of interesting challenges.
Well,
and a nightmare if someone breaks it.
It depends on how you do it. So let's discuss about this, because I'm working with several people on exactly this use case, right? So a lot of people are migrating right now either physical infrastructure or even virtual infrastructure that is, on the end of the life cycle, and they want to migrate it into a new environment. And the way you go there is you have an established environment where you have the virtual machines talking to VLANs, and you have whatever security framework or whatever management framework you have there, and suddenly now you are moving these machines into a new environment, and that's where you introduce actually network virtualization in order to solve some of the problems that you have with legacy. And let me explain to you what you have with legacy. In the legacy environment, for example, you have a set of firewalls or DPIs or load balancers or whatever that depend on specific IP addressing schemes, because you have ACL rules there or security rules there that have been inserted by hand several years ago, and nobody knows why they are there. And you go and try to move now this virtual host or this physical host from the traditional environment to the new environment. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that you maintain the same IP address on the servers. So when they hit the firewalls and the load balancers and everything, they will follow the exact same security rules. I'm not saying that you solve the problem that you have, that you don't know how to manage the security rules because they are very old, but at the minimum, you're not going to introduce a new problem into the equation, because what you do is when you move the host from the old infrastructure with specific VLANs to the new infrastructure, and by utilizing the network virtualization techniques, you extend the subnet over to the new environment, and from the host perspective, whether it was in the old physical environment or the new environment, is actually the same thing. Nothing has changed here. Does that make any sense?
It does, but it still says that you still. This is my biggest problem with SDN today, is that no one's looking at it holistically. Everybody I've talked to has basically said it's greenfield. You're going to be having a part of your data center that's going to be speaking all this, and then a part of your data center that eventually you're going to get rid of. I don't ever see that happening. I don't just see that. I just plain old don't see it happening unless somebody's come on from on down on top that says, this is what will happen. You will migrate to this and that. But we still see in data centers legacy systems. There are NT systems that no one can get rid of because they run an app that's so critical to the environment that they just can't move it. They can't do anything to it. It breaks. They're sunk. These are the things that
but that's exactly the thing, right? SDN cannot, I call that SDN washing. And the idea that SDN or some magic technology will come suddenly and solve all the issues on the legacy without touching the legacy, I think it's a unicorn, right? Reality is that what you want to do with a legacy is you cannot really go and suddenly make it programmable. It's not going to happen. You're not going to suddenly know that this firewall rule was inserted there 2 years ago because of this reason, and now I can go remove it and put it somewhere else and things like that, right? This is not going to happen overnight. But what you can do is you can provide the hooks to transition to new technologies that you can automate the new stuff without breaking the old stuff. And that is, I think, the goal here. Is not to go say that suddenly all the old stuff, I'm going to upgrade them to SDN overnight. I don't think the world is going to change like that. So in a way, we are agreeing here.
We are, but those gateways that I was talking about end up being, in my mind, a major attack point.
I don't think they are an attack point because...
Why not? They're a gateway. Most attack points are things that sit between other systems. If you can crack those things in between, you got everything, right?
Not really, right? Because these gateways or whatever gateways there, the way you have to think about them is like transparent bridges. They are not addressable, right, by anybody. It's not like they have a login. They are as attackable as a layer 2 transparent bridge. Because the only thing they do is they do bridging, right? So how many attacks can you do in an unmanaged layer 2 transparent bridge? There is not many you can come up with there.
Yeah.
Right?
And, I wanted to interject another point on that. What I've heard is a lot of the new SDN environments are the customers are actually requesting that the only way to manage the equipment is via a REST API. This means there's not going to be a web GUI where someone can log in set up mirroring, port mirroring without being detected, things like that. It's going to be all done through an API, through a central management console.
Oh no, that is absolutely true, right? These boxes, the gateways, or this functionality and stuff like that, and that's actually very important. And I think that we are going right now in a big area that in our mind is extremely important. It's not just the REST API; it's a whole policy framework. Who has authority to do what on every component of the system has to be managed by policy. If I see a lot of the systems that I have seen, what I call the first generation SDN systems, they give a login to somebody, and then whoever gets the login there can go and create any service on any gateway or on any endpoint and so on. That's exactly the wrong thing to do, right? The big thing here is the policy framework you instantiate on top of this SDN system that will say that, look, user A, it has the role of the network administrator and has the ability to do A, B, and C. User B is an application developer and can consume whatever the network administrator has done, right? And then even on the net, even on the together with the policy system, there is a whole audit logging system that says that the network administrator went and changed this policy on this particular day for that reason, and I need to recover these things. So a significant part of an SDN system is not how I move the bits around. Right? That's the easy part. The significant part is the policies in order to enforce this delegation and role-based administration of the system.
Mm-hmm. See, I guess my concern is that where these gateways will live. If they're living all within the physical network and their physical switches, and you can do all what you're talking about, that's fine, but they're living inside the virtual environment and they're not actually virtual switches, and they're virtual machines, kind of like the way Nicira came out. Nicira became an attack point. It was a VM, it's addressable, it's controllable, everybody has people can have access to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely, right. I mean, if
I'm talking about a SDN switch like an Arista switch that actually runs virtualization inside of it to separate the control and data planes, each one of those virtual machines, which is exactly what they are, also become attack points.
Well,
I'm not talking about attacking the network. I'm talking about attacking what goes around it.
Right.
When you think about this network, putting in a switch is great. I'll tell you right now, all those switches are going to be IP addressable. You just said it. Passing APIs between each other. How many secure APIs are known? Not many.
Okay. So let me explain that, right? The technology that we're building, because we have also a gateway of our own that is a hardware suite, right? It's the same technology and the same techniques to protect that as what is used in the public internet and the managed VPN services that service providers implement, right? So there are very specific mechanisms inside these devices in order to protect from some things. First of all, there is the management separation versus the data path and the services that they are running on different networks potentially. So there is no way to go on the management access, let's say, of the suites through the data path. But there are also very robust mechanisms there that say that not everybody has access to the management and control plane of the suites through a data path function. More importantly, the first thing that you are going to do is you are going to say that everything that comes, for example, in a VXLAN packet or anything like that is never going to touch the management layer, right? So you have mechanisms in these devices themselves to make sure that only authorized users or authorized interfaces can actually talk to these devices, right? I mean, if
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. We are using all the right words, and you're saying all the right things. You just said it: authorized users, authorized management interfaces, and I know for a fact that no one sets those up properly. I would say probably 1% of all the companies out there have authorization set properly.
Well, that's the goal now. That's where I'm going and saying the important part of the SDN piece and how we introduce this and manage these devices is not the devices themselves, but it's the policy and management system you put on top of them to make sure that you avoid these mistakes. And that's where our emphasis has been on the management and policy system to make sure that when I introduce a gateway, unauthorized users cannot change the configuration of this gateway, right? That's where the big challenge is. The challenge is not on the introducing a gateway and doing VXLAN to VLAN bridging. The challenge is on the policy system to make sure that unauthorized users cannot instantiate such a bridge without proper approval.
Well, but that's the thing, is that as soon as you, I mean, I agree with you. You just used all the right words, but I mean, even you've seen this as well. No one really sets it up so that all the right words get used.
But what I'm trying to say is that
we throw around the word policy like it's water in the saving grace, and it's really the most confusing thing in the world.
Well, the thing that's been missing is the ability to do this. And as the technology is now evolving to give us this capability to do everything through an API to programmatically control all these policies, these very complex policies, now that we have automation, we're able to build in automation of policy management. So it's not left up to an administrator to log on to a switch and remember to set up some secure encryption key and share it somewhere. It's all being done through an automation engine that handles this for you. So you can layer on very complex security policies and have it very easily be distributed and deployed and even audited through a central management system.
Exactly, that's the point, and that's what we are doing here at NUAS. That's what we call SDN. It's not just the fact that I can co-program the suite, it's the whole policy system that we are putting together to make sure that the right person can go at the right time and program the suites, and make sure that we audit this event and we make sure that we know about it and all this type of things, right? That's what we are doing, and we are calling SDN, not just the fact that I can go and program a flow in the suite. That's the less interesting part of SDN, right?
I agree that this isn't being done today, but one of the reasons that this isn't being done is the capability hasn't even been there. We have to build the capability, and then we can start talking about how to use these new tools to do what we want to do.
But I mean, the thing about it this way is that it's not just that. If you think about what you just said, policy and all that, first off, it's an overloaded word. It means too many things, too many people. So let's just talk authentication authorization, which is really a part of policy. But let's just narrow it down to just talking about ANA. Everybody does ANA using Active Directory. In the major companies, will they use the same method? And we're actually finding this in the virtualization world, that ANA and using Active Directory is actually inverse to the way some of the vendors have set up their authentication, their authorization. They use it just for authentication, nothing else. But if they start using it for authorization, what they have found is that no one's using least privilege to start with. If you need in a group, you're in a group. So what ends up happening is that when you look at the admins, they're almost always admins for everything instead of just what they're specifically supposed to be admins for, because of the group mechanisms. There's thousands of groups. And everybody's part of those thousands of groups, so there's no least privilege at all.
Let's bring that home and talk about...
Then you start talking about, let's apply that to our networking. It's like, no.
Well, listen, part of the challenge here is the lack of automation. I'm going to go back to say the same thing.
No, it's not automation. I can automate myself to death and literally automate my addition in groups. I'm talking about this no analysis of the existing authentication authorization to determine if least privilege is actually even in use. That I don't see. I can automate the creation of groups and stuff, but how do I do the analysis on the fly when I add a new person to ensure that they are actually following policy and are least privileged?
We've had to deal with this on a few projects. You're very astute. This is correct. There are some challenges here, but listen, there are also ways to solve these problems. Being able to audit something I believe that this is what we implemented in some of our last projects, is you need an automated audit process as well. So the owners of the groups, there needs to be at least one or two owners of each group. So in case someone leaves the company, there's a backup. If a group loses an owner, it gets escalated up to the manager of that person. So having all this stuff in place will allow you to send out an automated report, say once a month or once a quarter, to the owners of the groups to make sure that they are aware of who the people are in those groups.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. And how often will they get ignored because the business doesn't really care?
The business, yeah, well, this is
the problem. You're trying to say, let's take security and give it to the business, and business will say, yep, no care.
This comes back to a DevOps policy. So
DevOps policy does not imply security. DevOps can bypass security 6 ways a Sunday. I see it time and again with a customer of my own. They're an agile DevOps environment. They push things out, and security isn't even considered.
Can I give you an example?
When it's done right, I agree with you. But when it's done wrong, it doesn't work.
So as companies implement DevOps solutions, they have continuous builds with a bug quality tracker. Part of that will include metrics of how many bugs in their team. These audit reports have to be signed by the owner of the group, and if they are not, those get tracked on the bug tracker for that team. So having developers and data owners contribute and be part of the security, be part of the operation of the environment, enables us to make that environment more secure and sort of close the loop. So you have a dashboard for security and defects in your code so that they can look at everything all in one place.
But I think also in a DevOps
I agree with you 100% when it's done right.
Right, but in order to do it right in a DevOps environment, the way I see it is even network policy, and if you want security policy, has to be treated the same way as the code of the application, right? In other words, my network design, my security policy design, everything has to be in the same GitHub, if you want, as the application. A change or modification of the network policy or the security policy has to be reflected in the same bug tracking system as if I change a line in my application code. When we go in a real DevOps environment, that's what I would call the network as code, right? The network configuration and the policy configuration is just the same thing as the application, and it's tightly integrated with the application.
I would agree with you there, but how many people actually put that into their environment?
Well, it's not there yet, right? It's a work in progress, but I think that our goal, at least from our perspective, is to create the tools and the methods to allow people to implement something like that, right? But this is the real solution to the problem long term.
I think there's another part of that, and that is right now, if we're talking DevOps, on ingest of code, I can verify. I can do static code analysis and verify like the most egregious SANS top 20 coding mistakes or the biggest coding mistakes and basically reject it saying, hey, fix it, it's bad. I can also do that on build and ensure that I can fuzz it and things like that, and then reject the build if there is a security problem, then feed that back and say get it fixed and require overrides and all that. I can design such a workflow. And I can do it in an automated fashion. But when it comes to networking, what am I doing? How do I do that type of thing to say, yeah, it's acceptable, no, it's not? Then I tie it to authentication. How do I ensure that the people that I just gave rights to, because what we're missing here is, yeah, I can put the networking configuration as part of that. Who has rights to GitHub? Just about everybody. So I would have to lock down that particular part to a select group of people or have some way of verifying that code beforehand. But we're still missing the authorization model, which is if everything's right and we set it up and the business cares, then everything trundles and does all the right thing. But when the business doesn't care, they'll look at it and say, yeah, who cares? I need that done. Just make it happen. I'm authorizing you to do it. And that is the absolutely wrong person to authorize into your network because he just messed up 4 lines of config code and destroyed somebody else's application, but he's not part of that group.
Right.
So we're talking crossing groups. We're talking authorization versus authentication. That, to me, is the biggest problem with having all this type of thing going on.
So
Now, SDN, does it make that easier? No.
well, here's the
SDN
thing.
is just networking protocols.
It's kind of like the challenge we had when we started virtualizing everything. As you move shared, distributed applications into a shared environment, you now have the problem where one rogue admin could either, take the environment down or possibly even steal data from another, environment that he shouldn't have access to because of a configuration mistake or even just an oversight, like you said. Just get it done, give this guy admin rights, and he's going to come in here and take care of it, right? Well,
Absolutely.
in an SDN, I see the same challenges. I'm not saying that, we're this is the new panacea. It gives us a tool. It's a power tool to automate network events, network audits, network configurations. However, if you don't set it up correctly and have all the proper things in place, or if you're not operationally ready as an organization to deal with this new technology, you're going to basically, like you're saying, open up, you're going to expose networks that shouldn't be exposed and give people a lot of access they shouldn't have. There is a danger to SDN if it's not done right, just like any new technology.
Exactly, and I think we are all in a complete agreement to that SDN is not about the protocols and how you talk between things. A real SDN system starts with how can you ensure exactly this type of things? How can you ensure the authentication? How can you ensure the authorization? Who has access to what? When they have access, if they leave the organization, what happens to the objects that they created? Who inherits these objects? It's all these questions that have to be answered.
I think
more
people
than the
get
protocols.
caught up in the new technology. They say, oh, SDN, it's great. Let's start using it right away. That is very unwise, right? What you're saying, Dimitri, is that it's a new technology, but let's be careful about how we use it and where we put it, right?
Right, and put the proper mechanisms in the technology itself to make all these capabilities available, right? What I'm saying here is that if an SDN system is limited to mapping MAC addresses to tunnels, then it has lost the game. An SDN system has to start from policy and this type of infrastructure, and then go eventually and implement tunnels and things like that, right? It's the less interesting part.
Or do you see companies doing some sort of threat modeling or threat assessment before they implement an SDN solution, or are they mostly looking at operational processes? What is the typical roadmap for getting started with SDN?
I think that we are at the very early stages, and what I'm seeing is, at least from the projects and customers I'm working with, is that where people immediately, the reason that people want to talk to us is especially because of policy. And they understand what the technology can do for them, but it's the policy that what really attracts them to continue dealing with us, because that's some of the stuff that we are trying to tackle over here. And that's the main reason they continue the conversation, let's say. They know that they are not close to that yet, and it's going to be a long journey before they can achieve this complete automation that we talked about. And right, it's not going to happen overnight, but definitely it's where organizations will want to go, right? They want to make this control of the network driven by this type of things that we talked about, authorization and authentication, as much as possible, right? This is the dream, right? I'm not saying that people are there, and I'm not saying that products are there yet, but this is where things have to go.
Okay, I would agree with that. So you also mentioned using some form of analysis to determine that there may have been a problem or something's going on. Right.
You see, the trick here is that part of the whole idea of moving stuff to software and at the edges is the whole idea that and introducing systems, essentially another significant goal that I see in SDN is the introduction of analytics into the network. And what I mean by that, get a lot of visibility as to what is happening into the network in a centralized way where you can correlate information and try to detect if things are abnormal, right? And then based on this detection, you can figure out whether it's an attack or it's just an abnormal behavior. But the first thing is you need to understand if things are abnormal. And in order to do that, you need a lot of visibility insight into the network, right? And what is happening, I think, in the industry is that all these techniques or all these analytics methods that people have been using for other reasons, for business reasons, or to analyze how my customers are evolving, they are slowly coming into the networking space as well, right? So I don't have SNMP polls anymore that they are going to poll the switches for statistics once every 15 minutes. I can have a 1 second granularity on traffic behavior, and I can analyze this traffic behavior now and figure out if this matches my expectations or not.
Okay, well, that makes perfect sense.
Right? So essentially, it's a lot of instrumentation that has to go into the network, and we cannot rely on the traditional SNMP type of techniques to achieve that, right? We need to instrument the nodes themselves.
And how do you instrument the nodes themselves when the nodes are actually virtual machines? Because if I start adding more and more instrumentation in there, I start overloading the system more and more. If we're talking about instrumenting the switches, well, that's just hardware. I'm talking about the virtual side of that hardware.
Right. So you can instrument the virtual switches, first of all, inside the servers. So yes, you introduce some overhead, but actually the overhead is not that bad, as long as, if what you want to collect, for example, is what are the packets coming in and out of every virtual machine towards every other virtual machine. That's not, millions of counters. That's a very sizable event. And the key thing is to do it as lightweight as possible, right? So the way you do it as lightweight as possible is by utilizing these host models that increasingly people are using in data collection, that says that I'm going to collect the data in binary form and I'm going to have a streaming session that I'm going to stream this data to some analytic system, and the analytic system will be capable enough to absorb all this data host model, all these streams coming from all these nodes, and do a real-time analysis. So you minimize the amount of work you do on the nodes themselves, and you push this analysis in a scale-out system that you install based on Hadoop clusters and scale-out clusters and things like that in order to do the analytics there, right? So you separate what you do.
That's using a tool, I think it's Flume is a popular tool for pulling the data out.
Right, so Flume is one of these mechanisms, right? So Flume has a hierarchy, introduces a hierarchy to stream this data out, right? So, and people are using it increasingly on modeling web servers and stuff like that. Then there is technologies like time series databases that are built on top of, large data stores that allow you to do this type of analytics. So you use this type of techniques now that traditionally have been used in applications, let's say, but this type of techniques are coming now into the network.
And actually, they need to be there because they're using these types of techniques inside of various security tools already, such as RSA Silvertail, which does the exact same thing but with web data.
Exactly.
So, if you're talking about an SDN solution that has instrumented an Open vSwitch to provide this data, then that's wonderful.
Right.
I still see that being a problem unto itself because not every Open vSwitch is the same as every other Open vSwitch, and replacing one may be losing out on capabilities that you absolutely need to make your network work.
Right.
In general.
Right. So the way you have to see this, right, again, it's an evolving process, and not everybody is at the same stage already. But that's what happens with technology, right? Some people will start it and they will go towards this direction, and then people will realize the benefits and they will all join there, right? It's not an overnight thing, but it's definitely the way to move things forward, right? I cannot think of any other way to do it in a reasonable time frame.
Now, Eben, you had some questions on interoperability.
Yeah, my question was regarding these new. So first of all, it seems like we agree that a lot of the SDN solutions are going into a new set of servers. We're not basically retrofitting existing systems with SDN, although that's possible to bridge them with these gateways and whatnot. More and more, most of the environments are, setting up some new infrastructure and having that be kind of SDN enabled. So my question is, where are we on interoperability? I just recently got back from the SDN NFV World Congress in Germany, and I saw a lot of vendors talking about SDN solutions. A lot of customers even talking about how they were using them. But it seems like we're actually not getting away from the vendor lock-in problem. We have even more vendor lock-in almost with these SDN solutions. I'm wondering how, if there's anything going on in the industry or something you see in your experience, how vendors are working together to make their products interoperable in an SDN environment.
Right. So, it's actually it's a very good question, and because the industry is very new, people are following different directions, and I think things will converge somewhere. So what we are doing from our perspective, because we are talking about network virtualization, there is a specific area where people are talking about the network virtualization interoperability, and that's the ITF. The ITF, of course, standardized a lot of things, but it takes its own time. But I think I see a lot of progress happening in what is known as the NVO3 working group inside ITF of standardizing the model for network virtualization. Now, as part of this activity,
I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say the NVO3?
NVO3, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with that. That's network virtualization over layer 3, right?
Right, correct.
Okay.
And so that's one activity that is trying to standardize these interfaces. And actually, as part of these interfaces, we have contributed there some ideas where we say that instead of necessarily reinventing the wheel here, we can use an existing standard protocol for interoperability between controllers, and that is multi-protocol BGP. And as far as I know, there is 2 vendors as of today that support this, and that would be Nuaz, that is us, and that would also be Juniper Contrail, that they also support multi-protocol BGP federation. So you already have 2 vendors there. And honestly, I have heard also Bruce Davey from Nisira also say that BGP is the right way to make these things interoperate with each other. Now, I don't think they are there yet, but what this allows us to do essentially is to use something that is already tested and understood in order to federate or to make all these different systems talk to each other. And also it gives us the ability to interface with legacy networks that are already on the BGP bandwagon. So, we can seamlessly interoperate with them as well. So that's one of the proposals. I don't know if that's going to happen in the end or not, but there is activity in this front, right? And I would argue that a standards body like ITF is the right place to come and create this type of interoperability.
So it seems like a lot of vendors are sort of standardizing or accepting that VXLAN is going to be used for tunneling. Is that correct?
Yes, I think at this point, it's VXLAN is going to be the data format, and before it's even a standard, but it is going to be the de facto industry data format. And it's not just the vendors, meaning the SDN controllers and stuff like that, but it's even the server guys, right? NICs will be equipped with VXLAN encapsulations, right. And everybody is just converging on that.
This is a draft standard for VXLAN. Is that correct? It's not ratified yet.
No, the VXLAN is an ITF draft. It's not even an RFC stage or anything like that.
So
but
this is like going back to what happened with wireless. They announce it and they do a draft, and all of a sudden everyone's building systems with this protocol, and before it's even finalized, right?
Right. So in the end, it will be finalized. At this point, I have no doubt that VXLAN is going to become an ITF standard.
But maybe it'll be hopefully similar or close to what is the draft today, but some adjustments obviously could happen before.
Well, they do last-minute changes all the time, but the advantage here is most of these guys are doing it all in software rather than ASICs.
Well,
obviously.
listen, I mean, what did he say? We're putting it in hardware. Even NIC vendors are talking about it.
I know, but that's all right. All right, I'll take that back. I just find that so odd.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They do put it in ASICs because they think that's the way they can make more money.
So we have a lesson learned from the wireless industry of how incompatibilities can come apart. If somebody implements it today and then it changes, that it might not be compatible with something that comes out later on, right?
Yeah,
right. I mean
that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Performance might suffer if you put it into compatibility mode, let's say.
Right.
And interesting. And then the other term I heard you say was, I want to make sure I got it correctly. Is this the multi-protocol BGP? Is that stated MP BGP or is it BGP MP? I've seen it written a couple different ways.
Yeah, you will say I think the right terminology is multi-protocol extensions to BGP.
And is this you say this is very mature. This is a standard. This is not something that's going to change, next year or something like that.
No, this is how MPLS VPNs have been operating for more than 10 years now. I think it was ratified. It was an RFC status since 2003 or something, 2002 or something like that.
So the network operators have a lot of experience. There's a lot of IT people or network operator people resource knowledge. How to run this and operate it and troubleshoot it and secure it.
Right.
These things.
And there are a lot of tools built around it, right? So it's a very mature technology at this point.
Okay. Awesome.
When we start talking about all this, I mean, there's protocol after protocol after protocol. I mean, there's at least 4 that I know of, maybe 5 for SDN today. Some of them are actually implemented as encapsulations within protocols that actually may never be delivered. When we start talking about all those, I may be using every one of them in my network because, hey, Cisco does this, and Big Data does this, and VMware does this, and Hyper-V does that, and Zen does this, and KVM does that. Even if I'm using the Open switch in all those platforms and I have Open switch-based switches, they may not actually speak all the same protocols because they're missing all the different plugins. So when I'm thinking interoperability, I'm not thinking interoperability between like hardware. I'm really thinking about this massive disk-like hardware that you're going to see in every data center today. Yeah, the core switching may be all Cisco, for example. Or it may be all somebody else, but now or Juniper, but now you need to deal with where do we talk each protocol?
Let me share what I see customers doing, if you will. There seems to be the idea of building out a new rack or new row or new bubble, and this is where you put the new technology. The old stuff is going to stick around, according to your capital equipment life cycle, 3 to 5 years usually. And you need to refresh a third or a fifth of your data center. If you're just keeping business as usual, you got to refresh a third or a fifth of your data center every year. And that's where you're going to be building out some new stuff, getting rid of the old stuff. And you're going to have silos. You don't want to maintain 3 or 5 different silos of technology. So typically, companies will start a 2 or 3 year project to do this new technology. And that's the new silo. And then they'll maintain that for 2 or 3 years. And then after that, they get a chance to look at it and see if they're going to go, 80% to the new technology, accelerate it, pull it back, look at something else, right?
I mean, to give you another example, and we have to understand where we are in all this SDN technology evolution. I think we are back to the old Betamax versus VHS versus all kinds of other formats that have been happening. And I think the market is going to pick the winners, and that's what's going to equalize the conversation at some point, right? It's unavoidable. There is a lot of innovation happening right now, and obviously you are going to have all this type of mix and match happening. but I think long term we will, the market will pick the winners, right? And then the winning formats, if you want, will dominate. So it's very early on the conversation. That's why we are having this discussion right now. But in another year or two, I think these things will be much more streamlined.
Well, just look at the history of Ethernet. 40 years we've been doing Ethernet. How many really big Ethernet companies, switch vendors, are there? There's a lot of them.
Well, but there's a difference here, I think, and I'm not sure I agree with what was just said. So, Ethernet, we have a lot of vendors because at this point, it's an incredibly stable protocol. And, pretty much anybody can take the engineering spec and build a card that will interoperate with other cards at the Ethernet layer. But I'll point out, when they started doing like SPF and things like that, there were some hiccups. And, there's even hiccups sometimes when they modify how the cabling works. But, with respect to VXLAN and, the winners determined by performance, I'll point out that in link aggregation, right, when you have multiple ports on a card in a server and you're aggregating those ports either for performance or failover or whatever, there's a couple of different flavors to do that. And in particular, there's a Cisco flavor because Cisco is so dominant in the market. But yet there's the Cisco flavor and there's the standard flavor, and I think there's two other port aggregation methods that most people try to support them all when they write their software or they make hardware. But even though the Cisco method is not the standard, you kind of have to support it because there's so much Cisco gear. And we may see the same thing here. And this unfortunately is not to the advantage of the smaller players and the startups. They may work really hard on their protocol. They may work really hard on being standards compliant, but a Cisco or a Juniper or somebody can come up with a different protocol, and they have to play.
Aren't some of those
why not?
Where they need to get a license to use it, or are they open? That's my question.
Most of them are, if they're Cisco's, are licensed, unless it's in an RFC somewhere, and they implement the RFCs to the letter.
Yeah, I don't know in specific, or I'd have to research that. Or someone can Google it probably. But some of the Cisco stuff is licensed, some is not, right?
Because what you see happening now is everything's open source, right? That's what everybody's talking about. They're somehow working together on open standards and open source code, so things can be contributed openly and it's transparent. I think the business is demanding this, and you see the industry responding.
Well, you're right. That's what's true of the standards, right? You could be standards compliant, but there were so many standards to choose from. Everybody can open source their protocol, right? But that's half of it, right? If I come up with a protocol, the fact I open source it is meaningless, right?
But that's exactly the power of the users, right? That's what this whole SDN, if you want momentum, is all about, is to prevent vendors from inventing their own thing and trying to shove it down everybody's throat. Right? That's exactly the whole point of SDN, to try to make these things as software programmable as you can, so you don't have any situations like that.
No, you're right, and I'm totally on your side, and I'm on board with that process. I'm just pointing out that the big players can often do what they want, and unless the market rejects them,
right,
which does sometimes happen, but in many cases the market just embraces it because of de facto or de jure reasons, you then have to live with it, right? But that's my pragmatic, somewhat cynical view of it. But
you don't have to live with it. You as the person choosing what you're going to run in your network, you don't have to live with whatever you choose.
No. But it's kind of like the world of, back when you didn't get fired for buying from IBM, you don't get fired for buying from Cisco either. And unless you have the support of your CIO or whomever is allowing you to buy from the standards compliant startup as opposed to the non-standard compliant big vendor, you may be buying the big vendor anyway. That's what I'm saying. The market has to drive this, right? And we've seen that in Linux. People have to toe the line on Linux because a Linux shop will demand a non-proprietary distribution of Linux. So you don't see an IBM proprietary version of Linux anymore. But I'm just saying a lot of shops are very happy getting their gear from whatever their favorite vendor is, and they don't look so closely at whether the protocol is proprietary or not.
I have a perfect analogy for this. A lot of people are very happy by eating frozen meals, right? They buy the frozen meal and they put it in the microwave, and in 5 minutes they eat it, right? The question is that good for you, or do you know what is inside this frozen meal?
That's a very good question.
Okay, so that's exactly what the market has to decide. Do we need to continue eating frozen meals, or do we want to get components and actually make a home-cooked meal?
That's a really good one. I'm going to have to use that in a blog post.
Yeah, well, it's one way is healthy and one way is not, and the way that is not is actually, but this is where it's hard. It leads to a long-term deferred problem, right? Because when you get that vendor lock-in, it may be great for a while until it isn't. And it's sort of like not eating healthy. Not eating healthy, eating all the French fries and the soft drinks, that's great for a while until you get diabetes or whatever complications that ensue. So I think that is a very good analogy. I agree. But the problem is that a lot of people, because the consequences are not immediate, they eat unhealthy even though they know better.
Well,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Well, and this is all great conversation about food and networking and how they work together. But, we're getting down to our last 2 minutes of the call. And we all know there's a bunch of protocols in use. We all know that somebody's going to be using parts of them. Dimitri's talked about instrumenting Open vSwitch and doing a big data analysis to determine if something's gone kind of wonky or maybe a security issue. Where do we go from here? Last words. Eben, you first.
Wow. This has been a very enlightening call for me. I thought I knew a lot about SDN, but I actually learned quite a bit. And I think it just validates the need for testing. One of the things that we do in our company is test products, but I thought we would be able to test these things a lot sooner. However, I was surprised to learn that I knew that a lot of the code that we want to test is in beta right now, but even the standards are not fully vetted or ratified yet, and it's going to take some time before this becomes more mature or mature enough for us to actually start testing it. So I'm glad to hear that customers are using it, but I have a feeling they're probably just sort of evaluating and trying to test the waters to see how this technology might fit into the organization.
All right, I'll go next. I'm embracing these things. I think that the opportunities for automation and improvement of service and monitoring of service and, done right, improved security because of improved visibility and control makes this all a win. And my cautious note is you got to do it right and you got to have the monitoring and auditing, or it can be much less secure, and it can be a wonderful backdoor for privilege abuse. And the real gotcha that people experience in the world, though, is sometimes around automation storms and things like this. It captures the headlines, Netflix, Amazon, etc. When they have this automation breakdown, it's a big failure. And so the more we automate and the more we're relying on, basically these different elements of software-defined everything, we need to be cautious that we have capabilities in place to detect when the automation fails or when the automation is the problem.
And Dimitri, what's your last thoughts on that?
I think the big thing is SDN is coming for sure. I think we are at the early stages. I think that we will see increasingly where the areas of focus is not about bits and bytes and protocols, but the area of focus is around policy and around monitoring and around understanding what the network has done. And last but not least, let's stop the addiction on frozen foods.
And soft drinks.
And I got to say that I think that we need to go back to basics, and that is that if we're going to use SDN and we're going to use a lot of automation, we need to go back to the basics of authentication authorization and make sure least privilege is really what's in play in some fashion. It has to be a part of it because identity for everything is starting to become extremely important to prove out one way or the other.
Yep.
And by the way, sometimes frozen foods, if they're frozen organic foods, are okay. So, well, that completes another episode of the Virtualization Security Podcast. I'd like to thank Dimitri for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a good one.
Recorded live.
Welcome to the Virtualization Security Roundtable podcast, episode number 120, which has been a very long time. Our panelist today is Eben Rodriguez, an IT industry veteran, now serving as the Director of Virtualization and Cloud Testing for NSS Labs.
Hello, everybody.
Located here in Austin, Texas, where it's like freezing. It's 60-some-odd degrees outside. It's 60-some-odd degrees outside. It's too cold.
Yeah, it was 30-something last night. It froze. I had ice on my windshield.
And Mike Foley is joining us from VMware Technical Marketing Team, where his focus is on security of the vSphere platform. Myself, I'm Edward Haletke, a.k.a. TechSewell, just about everywhere you want to look, and author of several books on virtualization. And we're going to be talking about today XCCDF, OVAL, Harding guides, the works. Can one be translated to the other, and so forth? And hopefully some other people will join in on the conversation. We have a guest currently on the chat, so go ahead and ask your questions there, and I'll get them out there to the panel. So the reason why I'm bringing up XCCDF, OVAL, and all that without even having MITRE on the phone is because, as we know, the vSphere Harding Guide version 5.5 just came out. I'd like to thank Mike and all of his compatriots for putting through the effort, so thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
But also what came out is DISA came out with their STIG in XCCDF form about a month or so ago.
That's for 5.1, I believe.
Yeah, for ESX 5.1.
It's ESX 5.1.
It might actually be for 5.0.
No, it's 5.1.
Okay.
But even so, a lot of what the 5.1 they did in the STIG can be done in the 5.5 as well, and it still apply mostly. There's some 5.5 specific things that are not in there, but hey, those are easy to figure out.
So I got a question or a comment. It looks like we're able to. VMware's doing a really good job of getting the hardening guides out closer to the release date. And
that would be Mike is doing a really good job of getting the hardening guide out.
Well, I guess the question's twofold. I mean, obviously, the vendors are taking this more seriously and allocating sufficient resources to it. But does that also mean that there's less change from one version to another, so there's a little bit less work to do? And are governments and agencies and organizations able to adjust their internal documents and adopt this new technology quicker because there's less change? You know, what's behind all this?
Well, I will say on the 5.5 guide, if you look at it, there's only a few deletions and a few additions. There really wasn't a huge amount of change in 5.5, believe it or not. I mean, if you look at 5.5, it is probably the biggest change was the new SSO code, but with that, I actually ended up dropping 2 guidelines because there were 2 guidelines for setting the database password for SSO and the database user for SSO, but now that we no longer have a database, a relational database in SSO, what we call internally SSO 2.0, there wasn't any need for that. So there weren't a massive amount of changes. I mean, 5.5 is really a lot of good, solid QE and bug fixing, and with the major changes being SSO and vSAN, and vSAN's still in beta. But
there were actually a lot of changes to to vSphere 5.5, but a lot of them aren't related to security.
Right.
Or more to the point, we haven't figured out the security of them yet because they're so new. We don't even know what the vulnerabilities are to know what even to check. So all we can do is be very, very proactive. One of the other reasons why I wanted to bring this up, I actually had a really interesting conversation yesterday with a possible consulting client on encryption. And one of the things you have to worry about with encryption is if you start encrypting virtual disks, whether it's in the VM or using an encrypted virtual storage appliance, you actually have to up your security game. And the reason being is that there are so many different ways to get to that data unencrypted that you may or may not know about, depending on where you encrypt in the stack. If you encrypt, let's say I do encryption at rest, and I use a fabric encryptor. Once I'm in the admin, everything I read past that fabric encryptor is unencrypted.
Mm-hmm.
And who has access to all that? Anybody that's an admin.
Right.
And that means anybody that's an admin can then go off, suck down the data, or a really good electronic copy of that. So you really have to start paying attention to the hardening guides when you start upping your game when it comes to adding security like encryption.
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game.
No, it's not. You just don't add it and go. You have to add it and look at all these other things, because not only do you have to look at encryption, how the admin's accessing the system, which means you may have to tighten up role-based access controls, which no one really does. You may have to tighten up, how many different delegate users there are for all the different packages you're using to manage the environment, which everybody tends to use.
But nobody does.
They use the admin. I mean, why not?
Right.
But you also have to start looking at backup. You have to start looking at root access, who has it, why are they accessing the ESXi hosts, even whether or not the file browser is available to everybody.
And logging is also more important.
And logging goes through the roof. You absolutely have to enable massive amounts of logging. But all that starts. And when you start tightening it up, it's all going to start with the different profiles that Mike put into the vSphere hardening guide. Are you a DoD site or want to be treated like one, or are you like mom and pop and you really don't care? These different profiles make a big difference in how you look at the environment. Which doesn't necessarily translate to the tools to actually look at the environment to do this in an automatic fashion. Every hardening guide I've seen, and I will actually say XCCDF is the worst method of this approach.
Okay, why is it the worst? What makes you say that?
Is that none of the hardening guides are easily automatable.
They tell you how to do stuff using the GUI, using a mouse interface and no command line, or what is it?
No. Let's go into this a little bit further. When I say easily automatable, is that I should be able to parse the hardening guide or the XML and run a command across 1,000 hosts to get the answer for each individual host or the 20,000 to 30,000 VMs.
That's an audit.
When you do the audit, you have to do the audit first to find out where the weaknesses are, right?
Well, you need to have a security policy that you can audit against before you can audit.
Well, let's just say we're auditing against the hardening guide.
Okay, so you have the hardening guide. It's just printed out, on your desk or on your laptop, and you're one by one going through it.
There's multiple hardening guides. Let's talk about the DISA one. The DISA comes as an XCCDF, which means it could be read by OpenSCAP and a number of different other tools. However, it does actually absolutely zero number of automated checks. Everything is 100% due by hand. As a matter of fact, they even tell you really old stuff to do, like log into the console, go to the config file, and look at it.
I got you. So they're not using the APIs or anything like that is required for a lot of these automated checks.
And that's right. So their scope is the single VM, the single host, the less than 100 VMs, the things you can do by hand. When you start scaling the scope up to 1,000 hosts, tens of thousands of VMs, that fails miserably. Would you not agree?
No, absolutely.
So the scope of everything that is policy related when it relates to the virtual environment has to be at scale, at some scale, and it has to be well defined what that scale is. So if I create a hardening guide in my scale because it takes so long to run this, is only 500 hosts as a max, and I write a tool that does that, well, I need to have the scale in there.
Now, I haven't looked at it lately. The VMware one's nice because there's usually 2 columns for each element, and one is how to audit it, the other is how to configure it.
There's something like 20 columns, and it's actually descriptions of why you want to do this, the impact of actually
as far as
this hardening guide, And
there's
a lot of the
relevant
columns say not applicable, which means it's extremely hard to parse. But
there are many columns. And we could say a lot, a little. I mean, there's a number. I would say the majority of the elements are. There's very good examples in a scripting language like PowerCLI, how to audit it and how to also configure it. So what you're saying is the DISA one doesn't have any of that. It's like how to audit it. Open the console and look at this config file.
Yeah, it doesn't scale to any even past 10 machines. I mean, it would be very painful to implement the DISA hardening guide. Absolutely painful. I ran it.
Yeah, I actually wrote about that on a blog article.
You know, I ran it through OpenSCAP and got back a bunch of unresolved, unknown, because it can't do it. It actually prints out during the audit, here's the commands you run, and all the commands are extremely old and require you to shut down VMs even to make changes. It's draconian at best.
Yeah, so for example, if you want to turn off copy-paste, which requires setting a setting in the VMX file, or within vCenter you would call that the advanced settings of the virtual machine, which it just puts an entry in the VMX file. The DISA guidelines state shut the machine down, log into ESXi, remove the VM from inventory, edit the VMX file, add to inventory, power the machine on.
Yeah, that's
all from within the ESXi console, by the way, rather than 2 lines of PowerShell.
Or not even 2 lines, 1 line, and it's actually, to even look at that, it's just 1 line of Perl script. I mean, You can do this all in 1 line, and it's like, come on, that doesn't scale.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're writing a hardening guide, guys, make it scale. But also even make it go even one better. Make it interpretable so people can write whatever they want, because some people need XCCDF, OVAL, SCAP. Others just need to run a PowerShell script and get a report. Not everybody needs every functionality. They may not want to use PowerShell because their main engine is written to interpret XCCDF, which requires them to use Perl, or requires them to use another language. If we have an interpretable guide, machine interpretable guide, we have a much better step of going forward. Now, guess too on our thing is like it would be nice if there was a script to automate some of the post-security hardening of ESX vCenter based on the roles. And there actually is. You can use auto-deploy and write a deployment script to actually go off and do it while during deployment. I mean, base minimum, I should be able to do that. You know, put it in there, deploy it, set all the settings, done. But there's a problem with that, and that is that most people don't realize or run these hardening guides or hardening checks once every 6 months, maybe once a year when the audit comes around, which is also a problem because I'm patching probably once a quarter, or I'm patching VMs and standing up brand new VMs once a day, or every half day, or once a couple hours, right? If I'm standing up VMs, those VMs could be not from template. They could actually be in an insecure state and doing things wrong. So I need to do continuous monitoring. So anything I'd be able to do has to be able to interpret the new state of the virtual environment and rerun all the checks for that new state. And by the way, keep a history of what you just ran so that you compare it against the old state so you know it changed.
Mm-hmm.
So is this, now, I remember when we were trying to do the hardening guide, host profiles didn't track a lot of the things that were mentioned in the hardening guide. Has that improved at all? Are you able to now use check more things with host profiles?
No.
Host profile hasn't changed at all.
So it's not really
including
good for security.
Well, yes and no. You can guarantee that you have your networking, your disk, all that stuff laid out properly, so you no longer have to compare virtual switch tags and say, yep, they're the same. Host profile should automatically enforce that. If you need chat passwords and they need to be unique, you can definitely do that through host profiles. If you want to make sure CHAP is enabled, you can do that. If you want to make sure you hook up iSCSI, you can do that. If you want to make sure you have all the right networking done, you can actually do that as well. So it has its benefits. Matter of fact, one of the hard guidelines from vSphere is enable host profiles, because it does cover those basic functionality that has been plaguing us since day one.
Right.
But the thing is, enabling host profiles also means you have to check host profiles.
Well, that's what
here's the other thing.
You said that they don't. Most people check, once a year, maybe twice a year, and it's kind of a manual process. I thought you could schedule a host profile audit to run on a periodic basis.
Host profile audits run automatically. They'll tell you when you're out of sync all the time.
No, they have to be scheduled or run manually.
Okay. I generally do them then what I do normally is when I upgrade ESXi, I verify it against the host profile.
And then the other thing that most people don't know that I've learned recently is that you can schedule an alert to notify you when a host profile is run and it comes out of compliance. So it can send an email.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really cool to find configuration drift. But I was wondering if, since it doesn't check all of the things in the hardening guide, it's almost like we need host profiles to be scheduled, send alerts, and we need something similar to check a lot of the configuration things you mentioned that are in the hardening guide, like, is SSH enabled or whatever things we're doing for the hardening guide. We need to be able to check those outside of host profiles and send alert or audit reports on a regular basis. Aren't there tools that can help us with that?
Yes and no. There is no. Well, let's put it this way: there are there's very small tools from VMware that tie into the VMware Configuration Manager that will run older hardening checks.
Right.
There's a
I guess what I'm saying is
Alan Renault has a PowerShell tool that does some really old stuff. William Lamb hasn't upgraded his stuff to 5.1 or 5.5, and it was actually a very minor subset.
Mike, do you know if there's any plans to work with the kind of VMware ecosystem partners to rev the configuration monitoring tools for the new hardening guide?
I believe I just saw this morning. Let me look at my emails here, and I haven't posted it yet. Where the hell? It must be yesterday's emails. We've done a 5.5 checker. The free compliance checker.
Yeah.
For the hardening guide. I believe has just come out.
Okay, cool.
It's a very limited subset.
Yes.
Subset. And it doesn't cover all of them. So, for example, I do know that there are some vendors in the third party that I cannot name at this moment that are working on bringing their stuff up to the latest hardening guides. I also know that I've been posting this stuff on Twitter, that I'm actually working on one. I'm actually being able to automate all but 7 of the VM checks. Because there's no way to automate them yet. And then there is a way, but they're very, very difficult and require other tools to be in place and things like that. And then I'm actually working on the ESXi commands right now, and there's about 12 that I won't be able to automate easily. The problem is that none of them, and this is the fact is that not everything is queryable through the SDK, and not everything is queryable remotely. So they become very, very difficult to check without being on the host. And if you're on the host, that means you have to have root access to do these checks, which requires you to actually log in. Or you need to modify certain files on the host to allow you to query the host to get the file. And by doing that, you actually open your host up for attack.
Yeah.
And if you're doing continuous monitoring, which is you're running a test every hour, hey, if I'm on your network and I happen to know you're running this command, I'll just wait. Right? Wait till you open it up, even though it's only opened up for a very short period of time. I can wait. I'm patient. Yeah. I'm a hacker. I'm patient. I'll wait. Follow you right in. And it can be done. You cannot run a automated tool to check security that violates security to do the check.
So back to XCCDF, it sounds like that's a good idea, but the way it's implemented is not scalable, right?
Oh, actually, I've gotten mine to scale quite nicely. I've actually sped up my XCCDF by 100 to 1,000 times by doing some minor tricks. But
I guess what we need is a combination or a mapping of something like the VMware hardening guide, which can be scripted, to an XCCDF format.
That's what I'm saying. The VMware hardening guide cannot be easily scripted as it is today.
The VMware one can't.
Mm-hmm. No, none of them really can be. It's taken me how long, Mike, since I started working on this? It's taken me a couple of months just to get where I'm at now, and that's pulling in some older stuff I worked on to create 50. There's 58 virtual machine checks, and I can do 51 of them easily. And one of them took me a bit of research because the stuff changed. I'm now working on the ones for ESXi, and I've only gotten 7 of those done, of 30 some odd. I think it's 30 some odd.
Yeah, I mean,
so it can be done, but it's difficult.
If you look at the hardening guide, there's a number of operational guidelines that are things like, make sure your management interfaces for ESXi and vCenter are on a separate LAN. Those are things that are very site-specific, and really someone needs to sign off on having done that. It's not something you can automate.
That one I can automate the check of.
Yeah, I don't agree.
Well, I've done it, and you can do it.
We'll agree to disagree. There's another...
But another, for example,
there's a number of other operational ones that are more difficult to automate. When you start talking about automation of checking VM settings and checking ESXi settings and vCenter settings and so forth, an awful lot of those can be automated. But it's like every other security thing. Some of it requires someone to just say, "Yes, I did this," and sign in blood that they did that.
I mean, for example, there's one of them that says for every VM, ensure that the resources are not overused. Now, if I was to automate that one, and it can be done, I would either have to look in vCenter and say, hey, I'm a red flag. Well, that would be I'm using more resources than vCenter says I should be using. Maybe I'm looking at network, all the shares mechanisms and making sure I don't over-allocate shares. But I could also be looking at VC ops and going in there and looking to see if anything's outside of the norm. If it goes outside of the norm, I want to raise a flag. But what I just said was a lot of API usage for things that are outside of the traditional vSphere context.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes a question of what do you implement to do a check like that, and what really is valid for a given site. They may not be using VCOps. They may be using Xenos. Do I script Xenos, or do I let that do it? They may not be using shares, or everybody has vastly wild shares. They may not be doing it the way we expect it.
Let's talk about a philosophical discussion here on hardening guides and security standards. The purpose I see of security hardening guide from VMware is here's our best practices for our tools, right, to be secure. But an organization cannot just take that and 100% implement it straight out of the Excel spreadsheet they download from the website. The whole purpose is that they're supposed to bring it into their environment and customize it for their exact situation.
Well, and they may not have to customize a lot with the new VMware hardening guide, but what they need to look at is the VMware hardening guide is looking at very specific things. So looking at configuration of a virtual machine container, looking at the ESXi host configuration, the vCenter server configuration, VCSA, They're looking at very specific things, and they're looking at individual components. What they're not looking at, and what is missing from every hardening guide because of the scope of those hardening guides, is where everything joins together. They're not really looking at that. So what they do is yep, my vCenter server's hardened. Great. Who does it talk to? They don't know. Who talks to it? Are they doing that securely? Yeah, vCenter's hardened. It's well, who's talking to it?
No, come on. I mean, it says use SSL, trusted SSL certificates, for example. And how
doesn't make a difference. SSL has 5 different attacks against it, and all of them work against vCenter, by the way, all of them. So it may say use them, but if I'm using certain clients, I can bypass all your security quite easily. So
are you saying that we shouldn't check to ensure that SSL certificates are trusted and issued from a trusted certificate authority? Okay, well, I'm taking that as an example. Whether or not it should be in there or not, you can debate. But what I'm saying is
no, I'm not saying it shouldn't be in there. It should be, but you cannot depend just on that checkbox saying.
No one's suggesting that's the only thing you should do to secure your environment, okay? There's 50 to 100 things that are in this hardening guide that companies should look at individually and figure out how they should implement that security check for their team. There will also be other things that they also need to do that are not in the hardening guide that they should also be doing to secure their environment. So but when I talk about one exact element of this hardening guide, and I'm bringing it up as an example to talk about, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't also do other things. Okay, so please.
Yeah, let's remember the scope. It's called the vSphere Security Hardening Guide.
So,
it's not
I'm just
called.
Taking an example.
Hold on, let me finish. It is not called the Virtual Data Center or Physical Data Center Hardening Guide.
Right.
Right?
All I was saying
because it's enough to do one of these hardening guides. Believe me.
Yeah, I agree. But what we were talking about, what if I'm using a different management server instead of vCenter or something? What I'm trying to get at here is that an organization has now the luxury of downloading this Excel spreadsheet, and where we have told them they need to use a trusted certificate authority to issue their SSL certificates for all their hosts and how to do that, an organization can go a step further and say, here is the certificate authority we use here. We need to check that it's valid in this certificate authority, right? So they could add to it and improve or enhance what VMware's guidance is for their specific organization. That's all I'm saying.
And not that they can, they should.
Yeah.
They should and they must.
This is not you can improve on it, but you should improve on it.
And the nice thing is, it's very easy because it used to be hardening guides would come in a PDF format that was difficult to edit and change for your environment. And now it's an Excel spreadsheet, so it's a lot easier.
I don't say that. It's not any easier or harder. They're still going to print it out. They're still going to run them by hand. It cannot be done continuously today in the form it's in today. As a matter of fact, if you look at the virtual environment, if you're trying to be non-intrusive, there's only one location that is actually, 2 locations, to be honest, that are actually the ultimate locations for data inside of a virtual environment, and that is the management tool and the hypervisor itself. And if you're going to do that, you need to be able to have a tool that can talk to the management tool, in this case vCenter, suck out all the data for every VM and compare it and look at all the VM isolation settings, for example, and tell me per VM which one's violated, which one's not, so that I know per VM which one's to fix. So when I look at if I'm looking at 10,000, 20,000 hosts, maybe 9,998 of them pass, 2 don't.
As you're talking about this, it almost sounds like what the Splunk VMware app does, and I just am wondering if it could do a hardening audit.
No, it can't.
I wonder if it could be configured for that or adapted for that.
In Splunk?
Yeah, because Splunk has a VMware app that they just updated with the latest version where it actually goes to vCenter and queries it for all this information and presents a dashboard. And this dashboard has the ability to display anything that vCenter knows about. I just don't think it has security, like a security component to the dashboard, but that would be very interesting to look at adding.
Yeah, it would be. Absolutely would be. But it's still actually a fair amount of work to do. It's not as simple as doing just producing an XCCDF, which is what I've been working on from the Excel spreadsheet, has been a very big effort. But it runs and works for subsets of those. And it's knowing how to interpret it as well. For example,
are you open sourcing that so that others can look at it?
Don't know yet. I don't know yet. I'm using it I'm personally right now using it for my own consulting, but I don't know what I'm going to do with it because it's actually a huge amount of effort.
Security should be shared, not held close.
I haven't finished it yet, so how can I know?
All right.
When you look at the way that, by the way, I won't open source something or put something out in an environment where I haven't finished it yet, at least the first iteration, because then you just get all sorts of drift in ideas and designs. So I would rather do that. But that's just my concept of open source. But when you start looking at different aspects of that hardening guide, or different aspects of any hardening guide, for example, some of them are, some of these things for hardening are broader than just one thing. Yeah, I need to harden the vCenter host. Great, wonderful. And the fact is for the vCenter security, vCenter appliance, right? Didn't they say that they're putting the DISA-STIG embedded inside of it so that they can run against the Linux STIG and tell you how hardened it is? I think that's a great idea.
No, it's not running against the Linux STIG.
Oh, no?
So we have, as Simon had mentioned, we worked with DISA to create a virtual appliance OS STIG.
Oh, okay.
And the OS in the vCenter server appliance and 13 other virtual appliances, things like login sites, so on and so forth, they're all based on the same code base from an OS standpoint. Those are all, depending on the virtual appliance, between 91 to 95% DISA-STIG compliant to that virtual appliance OS STIG that we helped to write.
And I think that's a great step in the right direction. And
yes, and it's not the only step we're going to be doing either.
Is that appliance using, does that STIG is actually embedded in the appliance so that the appliance is telling me how its own security? Or do I have to actually call it?
I don't know. That's probably a good question for Simon.
Well, if you can forward it off, that would be great to know the answer. I think it should be embedded and periodically run by the tool that's inside of it.
I don't disagree with that.
And callable remotely when I actually do my own tools. And how often is it going? I mean, then how often is that STIG going to be updated? You know, is it going to
I don't know.
up? Things like that become questionable questions. I still think the scope is a little narrow, but that's just me, and I agree that this is for vSphere. But when I look at it, I'm thinking larger volumes of vSphere servers, larger volumes of VMs than most people, I think, when they look at this are doing. But I'm also looking at all those interactions between everything. So if you are going to use this is just a starting point. It is not the end all. You have to map it to your policy. You have to know who's talking to what. You need to know the attacks against those major communication protocols, and how are you going to protect against them? You know, we just picked on SSL, but that's an easy one. But there's other mechanisms we have to still look at. Who has access to the SDK to make these calls? How's role-based access control actually done?
If it's done at all.
Privilege? How do you do least privilege inside of Active Directory? If I have a very large Active Directory environment, is my virtual management complex or management tools using a subset of that or full access to everything in it? And does that mean I set up a group where the CEO now has full admin access to vCenter because suddenly it appeared because I included a group wrong in vCenter. How do I verify that? You know, I haven't even we don't even have means to verify that yet, right? When you add security, you got to start talking about these other things. You need to verify ANA. You need to verify least privilege. And those aren't part of any guide that I've seen, right?
Yeah, it's it's
yeah,
a
that's
challenge.
not a hardening guide. That's more of a security policy for an organization.
Absolutely, and those policies where the guide is part of that policy, not the other way around.
Oh no, I mean there's going to be policies, there's going to be standards, there's hardening guides, and there's guidelines. And they have to be different documents. What do you mean part of that standard? They can refer to each other. A policy would say that each individual system in the secure environment needs to be configured according to the hardening guide for that system. And you're not allowed to use systems in the data center that do not have hardening guides that are kept up to date. Hardening guides should be reviewed and updated once a year, things like that. That's what the policy says.
The policy should say once every quarter.
Well, it's up to the on a periodic basis, you know. The organization gets to decide how often they do it.
True. I would rather use the word periodic than actually put a time limit, but
that wasn't my point. I wasn't trying to say that what the period should be. I was saying periodic. So it'll say you need to have a password policy and enforce that password policy. And there's a password policy that actually says what that is. So a lot of the things you're talking about are very important, but they fall outside the scope of a hardening guide. I guess the message here is you need to have a comprehensive set of security policy documents for your organization where you say what you're going to do, and only if by having that documented can you then go about auditing that. And if VMware releases a hardening guide for vSphere environment, you can't just use it right out of the box. You got to download it, read it, maybe test it, and then make sure it's adapted and working correctly for your environment, for your applications, and for your support team, and that it can be audited in your environment.
I'd like to add to that point. I've been waiting to add to that point. I almost on a weekly basis get a phone call from someone, customer, technical account manager, what have you, and it's the IT guy telling us the security guy dropped the hardening guide off and said, go implement it.
Wow. And I did, and everything broke. My users can't log in anymore.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why I changed the profiles column that was in the 5.1 hardening guide to risk profiles, in hopes that the security guy would see the word risk, and that being a keyword or a dog whistle to a security guy, would then actually go ahead and actually read the introduction about what risk profiles are. I also made it quite clear. I also made it quite clear when I announced the 5.5 guide. I wrote a paragraph in the announcement on my blog, on the vSphere blog, saying that the hardening guide is a set of guidelines, not a set of mandates. That every single guideline should be reviewed to see, one, if it's relevant to your environment, and two, if it breaks something. And so, for example, the disabled data store web, if you implement that guideline, you will break backups. So which is more important? Breaking backups, which I believe is a much higher risk than the possibility that someone might be able to see, log into the data store web and do something, which really all they can do is just see things, and that they need an account, they need access, so on and so forth. So
Well, and then actually,
these folks that just say implement the hardening guide are not people out there. If you're listening, if you say to your IT guy, "Go implement the hardening guide," you're not doing your job.
Not only that, I mean, you may have other controls you have to put in place besides what's in there,
exactly,
or in place of what's in there. You actually have to read through it.
Right.
There's always a compensating control, and not only that, if you're a security guy saying this, hey, that's great. But you also have to check with your compliance guy because some of these could impact compliance.
Right.
Remember, security and compliance are totally different.
In most cases, it's the same guy.
But one does not necessarily mean the other. I mean, for example, there's a lot of things that I like about the vSphere hardening guide that's out there, and all of this is you actually do talk about what it will break if you did this. And I think that's a great thing to have in, and that's what they need to read. The implementation of it, that's one thing. Instead, what they should be doing is saying, okay, and my thing is that there are ways of taking the vast majority of the hardening guide and writing a script that will at least report on what's there. My first step would be, hey, run me this and tell me if it's there. Or better yet, give the security guy read-only access, allow him to use PowerShell, let him have fun. And he can go through and figure out what's actually there before he goes and says a draconian measure, implement this. If I was the VI admin, I'd just say, forget it.
Yeah.
Waste of my time.
So one of the things I would highly recommend to all you security folks that are listening to this podcast and you want to learn more about virtualization and the whole thing that the whole language that the IT people are talking and you're feeling very frustrated is go to the learning section on VMware.com and look at the VCA exam. It's a free exam. You can there's all sorts of stuff in there, and what that gives you is kind of that what do they call it? That touchstone that allows you to decrypt what the hell the IT guy is talking about. It helps you with learning all of the components within the virtual architecture or infrastructure, and really the vast majority of these security things that we talk about in the hardening guide and we talk about here on the podcast are things that are really operational in nature and or can be either mitigated or addressed with better operations. And I really don't want people to walk away with the feeling that they're lost when the IT guy says, you don't need to know that. Well, you probably do, but I also don't want the IT guy to be getting mandates from the security guy saying, you must do this without knowing any of the possible implications of implementing some guideline. You really be informed. That's all I can really end that with.
And if you're not running vSphere environments, which Mike has to talk about that, there is,
sure.
You go to virtualizationbookshelf.org, there is a security section that covers and many other hypervisors mentioned. You can actually go to your hypervisor and just pick a book, any of them, and there's ones for Hyper-V, ESXi, vSphere, KVM, vSphere, Hyper-V, KVM, Zen. Go through them, look at them, read them, and it'll at least give you a basic understanding of what's going on. The technologies are pretty much the same across the board. The concepts are the same across the board. The implementations are very, very distinctly different. And that's where you need to start learning about the language. But from the hardening guide perspective, let's step back there for a second. There is no oval version of this. So if you are required to do oval or SCAP, right now there's no oval version of this.
So, Ed, you've talked about a lot of acronyms that I've actually heard before, but I wonder if you could just take a minute to explain the relationship between XCCVF and OVAL and any of those other standards. And you said MITRE wasn't on the phone. So what's the relationship with MITRE and these other acronyms that we keep hearing about? What are these? And how will these help us or impact our lives down the road?
Well, if you're in the federal government, you are required to work with SCAP generally. That's the Security Content Automation Protocol. It's from NIST. And what that means is it reads certain files, XML files, and runs an automated check of some form, or reports back at least information you need to say, yes, I did it, no, I didn't. So it presents an unknown or check or fail or pass generally. SCAP can interpret OVAL or XCCDF. And that's just two different things from MITRE. And MITRE is just an organization that their whole goal is to come up with ways of assessing environments. OVAL is the Open Vulnerability and Assessment language, and you can actually use that language. And that part of that language is something called XCCDF. And XCCDF, if you want to know it, is a markup language that you can use. And there's all sorts of different editors for it.
Right.
And the markup language, it's called the Extensible Configuration Checklist Description for blah, 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 whatever.
And this allows sort of automated audits or reporting, at least, of different environments, if it's set up correctly, right?
It allows you to provide a automated reporting, automated scanning, if you have the tools to do the scanning and the language has been written for it. For example, writing an XCCDF from the Excel spreadsheet can be done. DISA did it very badly. The one that's from VMware, I'm doing one right now that is actually doing many, many more checks and a few that are not normally done. And going in and not only checking for things that are, is it enabled, but will it be enabled when you reboot machines? So each of these checks that you do, we can pick on any of them. There's usually more than one thing you need to look at. There's usually two or three for certain of them. You need to know what those are. It's just not just look at this. It's looking at, if you run the PowerShell scripts inside of these, the PowerShell scripts, if you're running it on Windows, maybe XCCDF can talk PowerShell. Right now, I don't know if it does. OVAL doesn't, but they generally talk to something that can talk the right language. It depends on the interpreter you're using, so you need to make sure you have the right interpreter.
So
they all tie together.
If we had blue skies and happy times, and you had your choice of how the hardening guide would be delivered, what format would you pick?
I like the spreadsheet. I just want columns that make it easy to pick out what elements of the SDK I need to query. Because then I can write it to interpret it and get the right element all the time. Let me take a point, in case say the point. If you look at the VM, the hardening guide, and you look at the VM page, have in there the advanced setting, and all but 7 of those, actually I take that back, all but 8 of those are advanced settings. You look at advanced settings on all but 8. The one that is an advanced setting is enough that you can actually look somewhere else to do it, but you should be able to give me the exact language, the exact field to query inside the SDK and the exact value I'm looking at. Is it not equal to that value? Is it equal to that value? Allow me to interpret it, because the reason why you can't codify as an XCCDF or an OVAL is because they don't interpret the virtual environment. You have to actually query this per VM every time there's a new VM, or periodically throughout the time. So I could literally write from the Excel spreadsheet, given that information, I can literally write a single line command in Perl, which is what I did, that I can write an XCCDF that calls a Perl script that does this automatically. Boom, done. Every next time I run it, it pulls out the information for every VM. I have new VMs, it picks up those new VMs and does it automatically. So I got to handle the new stuff as well as the removed stuff.
So the purpose of a hardening guide isn't to automate the audits and configurations. It's to give people tools to be able to do that themselves. So those people that are consuming the hardening guide could be an organization that already has a bunch of scripts, or it could be a tool vendor themselves that is writing the script. Like we got all these people that we talked about. Mike mentioned them. that have written little tools that do audit checks or whatnot. So they need the hardening guide. Would they? And then you also need to have all that text that's around it to know how to interpret it. So I think the Excel spreadsheet is useful for human readable format, but we also need to have their oval schemas updated whenever the hardening guide is released. Is that something that we could be asking vendors to do?
I'm not sure oval needs to be updated. I think if you have the proper tool, you can read. I mean, like for example, a tool I'm writing literally takes the Excel spreadsheet, opens it up, reads the workbook, which happens to be the page, the sheet, reads the sheet from the workbook that says VM as the title of the sheet, writes the XCCDF on the fly based on that sheet. And not only that, because some of these are not isolation settings, but they're further settings, like for example on disks, you need to be not independent persistent. And that, if you have that in the guide, you need to look at every disk attached to every VM. So if there's more than one disk, you have to look at all those disks, and I need to report on those individual disks. If I add a disk, remove a disk, I need to know that too. The virtual environment's not static, so the environment that you're testing in, whether it's using SCAP, using XCCDF or OVAL, or your own scripts, cannot be static either. It has to be a dynamically produced test based on the fact that we're constantly adding, subtracting, removing, moving, whatever.
Okay, so help me make the hardening guide better / more consumable. Is that more columns, less columns, a different format, what have you? Go.
I'll talk to you offline on that because I have some ideas that may or may not fly. But at the very least, they need to be a little bit less certain columns need to be less prosaic than others. More answer here. Here's this query. Here's the answer type of thing.
Mike, what we can do, this is actually, I'm glad that you asked that question, and I think on the podcast we can leave it at asking that question and then getting feedback. So it's from the industry, right? If you just released the latest updated version, people are going to start using 5.5 and wanting to harden it. So there's a review period that we can now go through that you're soliciting feedback that we can use that feedback as you do the next.
I've been soliciting feedback for 2 months and didn't get it until the day after I
know.
published.
That's how it goes. But can you give us some ideas of, your plans now? Are you able to sort of make a patch if needed in a month, a week? What are you thinking on that? And then I assume you'll start working on the next version in 6 months, a year, whenever. Yeah, whenever it comes out, right?
Yeah, so I don't usually work on the hardening guide until we are at a release candidate / release to manufacturing level, because there's just so much changing between the time of an internal beta to external beta to release candidate to release to manufacturing to general availability. So I tend to go and use the absolute closest thing that customers are going to use, because there's just far too much moving pieces.
Absolutely. So ESX 5.5 was released like a month ago, and you just released the hardening guide really quickly within a month after that. So can we
20 days.
Can we throw this out there as an idea that, not asking you to commit, but if all goes well, there'll probably be a 5.5.1 patch sometime soon, and then you would release the hardening guide shortly after that, an update to the initial one.
Well, in the past, the practice has not been to release a changed hardening guide. So there wasn't a changed hardening guide for any of the 5.1 updates. I may release a 5.5 update 1 version of the hardening guide, and it would be probably sometime after the 5.5 update 1 release is, whenever that is.
Right. Okay.
When you start, and not only that, Mike's taking feedback from everybody that's looking at it, and I know for a fact that if there's enough feedback that require enough changes, most likely there'll be something coming out.
Okay.
You know, you're not going to keep something static that should be dynamic. So,
right.
I think I think you're right. I think that if you have anybody that's listening to this that has commentary on this, please get in touch with Mike, and you can do that using the VMware Communities Forum. The security forum is one that he does monitor, so you can actually put commentary in there. If you know how to get a hold of him on Twitter, go ahead. If you know how to get a hold of him via email, go ahead. Right, Mike? Anything else?
Yes. So the best place on Twitter would be the best place on Twitter is not my personal Twitter account. It is at vSphere Security.
All right, man. Thank you.
And then what we can do is when everybody goes through it, that'll be great. There's a lot of stuff here, guys. This is my last thoughts. There's a lot of here. This is just the bare minimum that you have to do. It's a starting point. It's not the end all. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, there are no silver bullets in security. As I keep saying, I said last week when I hosted the vSphere Communities podcast, security is not a destination, it's a journey. There's always something new. There's always something different. And when you're looking at the virtual infrastructure, there's 1,000,001 moving parts. It's like a helicopter. There's a lot of parts, and it only takes one small break to have a disaster. So you really have to. Yeah. Yeah.
And
so
even your last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, kudos to Mike and the team for getting that out so quickly after the latest release. And I think you guys have raised the bar yet again as to hardening guides that should be released from any product vendor, specifically in the hypervisor space. But good job. Let's see more of that from others. I'd like to see a little competition here.
Good. So, and with that, I'd like to end the podcast. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.